There was little doubt that the real solution was a genuine variable geometry aircraft. It came in the form of the MiG-23. The prototype of the MiG-23 was called the E-23I. I stands for the Russian word meaning variable. The prototype made its first public appearance at the Domodedovo Air Show in 1967. The wings were swept and unswept several times during the course of its demonstration flight and attracted a great deal of attention from Western observers. The MiG-23's range of wing sweep was very similar to the F-111's. At its straightest, it was swept back 17 degrees. This was the setting used for takeoff and landing. Most of the mission for which the MiG-23 was designed is carried out at subsonic speeds with the wings at a 45-degree angle. Only for a few minutes of a normal mission is the full supersonic flight sweep angle of 71 degrees called for. The 3 sweep positions were preset, and it took about 15 seconds to move from one to the other. The Monino Air Force Museum outside Moscow contains one of the world's largest collections of significant aircraft. Many of its more than 120 exhibits are prototypes. This is the E-23I, the prototype of the MiG-23. It is exhibited with its wings in the straight position. Next to it is another early MiG-23 with its wings fully swept back. The wings of the prototype were thin. They had full-length trailing edge flaps, but no ailerons. Lateral control was achieved by horizontal stabilators and spoiler surfaces on each wing. The spoilers operated independently. If one was raised, it created drag and reduced the lift of the wing, causing the aircraft to bank. The wings were mounted level with the top of the fuselage, which was quite flat from just behind the cockpit right back to the tail. The wing hinges were located in large swept shoulders well outside the fuselage. The cockpit canopy was flush with the fuselage top and had almost no view backwards. It was designed with great faith in air-to-air missiles and high supersonic speeds for air-to-air interceptions. This was no dogfighter. The drive of the wing sweep mechanism was hydromechanical. It was operated by 2 redundant systems acting together. If one failed, the time taken to move from one sweep position to the next was increased by half. This is the fully swept position of 71 degrees. The landing gear of the MiG-23 was unique. It was one of the most complex systems of 3-dimensional mechanics of any aircraft ever built. Each wheel had to be hidden in a fuselage of relatively small cross-section, but at the same time the track had to be wide enough to provide stability on rough airfields, and the need to work from unmade surfaces meant that a mudguard had to be incorporated into the design. The MiG-23-23I on display at Monino was the first of at least 10 prototypes. The first production MiG-23s had twice the jet thrust of the MiG-21. They weighed twice as much and carried twice as much fuel. The pilots also had to come to terms with the extra factor of manually changing the wing sweep during flight. Production MiG-23s were equipped with a KM-1 ejection seat, which could operate at speeds from 85 miles an hour on the ground to 745 miles an hour and an altitude of 75,000 feet. MiG-23 pilots didn't like the seat because it tended to cause back injuries. Some even preferred to crash land rather than eject. The chief designer of the MiG-23 was a former great MiG test pilot, Grigory Sedov, who test flew the MiG-15, 17, and 19. He says that the MiG-23 was the first true fighter with variable geometry to be produced anywhere in the world. At the time of the development of the MiG-23 prototype, Artyom Mikoyan had been given the title of General Designer, a rare honor in the Soviet aviation hierarchy. It meant that he not only had the authority to guide the development work of the airframe of any new aircraft, but all of the subsystems as well. He was therefore completely answerable for the eventual performance of any fighter aircraft developed under his control. It was a position of great responsibility, but also one of great power. The nomination to the position of General Designer to any design bureau was considered and approved by the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Even the minister responsible for the aircraft industry could not dismiss a general designer. Such a decision could normally be taken only at the level of the Politburo. Mikoyan was a man of great distinction in the Soviet Union. This is the celebration of 2,775 years of the city of Yerevan, the Armenian capital. As a native Armenian, Mikoyan was an honored guest at any major state celebration of this Caucasus Republic. Status of this kind under the Soviet system was not directly rewarded by money, but it did provide privileges that could not be bought by money. In the 1920s, Stalin introduced a system of stores that were only open to people at a certain level of the party hierarchy. Here they could buy goods for lower prices than those available to the general population. People like Mikoyan were also provided with good large apartments, a car with a driver, who was in fact a servant, and a large dacha, a house in the country. But during many years of the Soviet regime, these privileges were balanced by great risks. For the first 13 years of the MiG Bureau's life, Stalin was in power. During that time, many prominent Soviet citizens were purged on little more than a whim. The aircraft industry was particularly subject to Stalin's erratic decisions. There was no career security in being head of a design bureau under Stalin. Artyom Mikoyan survived the Stalin years. In the 1950s, achievement followed achievement at the MiG Bureau, and by the mid-60s, Mikoyan had become a man of great distinction, commanding the affection and respect of everyone who worked with him. But his health, which had troubled him in the past, was failing. Artyom Mikoyan was a great family man. In the Soviet system, there was a tradition of family and political influence in the creation of aircraft design bureau heads. Yakovlev's father-in-law was a Soviet prime minister in the early days under Stalin. Andrei Tupolev was succeeded by his son as head of the Tupolev Bureau. Artyom Mikoyan's career was helped enormously in the early years by the fact that his brother Anastas was a revolutionary and a close associate of Stalin and of Khrushchev. Anastas Mikoyan was a powerful man in the Soviet hierarchy. He was a long-time member of the Politburo and in 1964 became Soviet president. Without the influence of Anastas, it is doubtful that Artyom would have had his rapid rise to power, coming out of obscurity to head what became one of the greatest Soviet design bureaux. Artyom and Anastas remained close. Here they're playing Nardi, a dice game popular in their native Caucasus. It was also widely played at the MiG Bureau in lunch breaks. There is no question that his brother's political influence continued to be a help as Artyom Mikoyan's career developed, and to shield the young bureau from Stalin's purges of the 30s and 40s. But there is also no question that Mikoyan had the genius to make the most of his position. He was a great man. He was single-minded in his efforts to drive the bureau he headed to higher and higher achievement. The MiG-23 was to be the last project Artyom Mikoyan would personally lead. In the early 50s, he'd had to take time off work because of a physical breakdown. He'd been susceptible to heart problems, but still, in spite of the advice of friends and doctors, kept a demanding work schedule. In 1965, he had his 60th birthday. He'd been the head of his bureau since it was established in 1939, when he was 34 years old. 26 years of stress were beginning to show. He was now a grandfather several times over and delighted in the company of the younger members of the Mikoyan dynasty. In 60 years, Artyom Mikoyan, the Soviet Union's great designer, had come a long way from the little village in Armenia where he was born. This fir tree was planted by Mikoyan in a position where he could see it from his office window. In the summer of 1969, he had another heart attack. His office is kept as it was on that day. It was 30 years since he established the MiG Bureau in partnership with Mikhail Gurevich. Gurevich had retired in 1964, and now Mikoyan left the building on Leningradsky Chaussee and moved with his wife to his dacha in the country. His wife recalls that period in 1969 and 1970. He kept in touch with the MiG Bureau. People would come to visit and consult, but he never returned to his office. For this great man, recipient of almost every honor his country could bestow, the dacha and its garden became the setting of the last months of his life. On December the 9th, 1970, Artyom Mikoyan died after open heart surgery. The following year, the MiG Design Bureau was renamed in his honor. It became Mikoyan, but the aircraft it produced were still called MiGs. The seat Mikoyan vacated at the head of the Design Bureau passed on to his nominee, Rostislav Belyakov. In 1971, the MiG-23 became fully operational with the Soviet Air Force. It was now the frontal fighter, theoretically replacing the MiG-21.